Jackie's presentations. Professor Grebmeier from University of Maryland, Chesapeake Bay Lab, is going to talk about broad-scale studies from sea ice to biological impacts and associated feedbacks on the marine ecosystem. I want to clarify that this is the second part of a series of 3 discussions on this topic. The first one was a couple of months ago when we had Manfredi Manizza and Carin from Scripps and Clark University, who discussed biological trapping of heat by chlorophyll and other organic matter in the water column. So today's call will address potential ramifications of that of those processes further up in the food chain. Jackie, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Guillermo. So what I wanted to present today is a composite of a variety of programs, and you can see the author list on that. And I'm going to be, the format of the talk is to go through those different programs and just some highlights. And I'm talking about the DBO, the AMBON. You can see the acronyms on the top of the slide, and they're spelling out on the bottom. And there'll be more information on the slides as they come forward. So what this is just a composite of what we're doing in the field now and some of the findings related from CI up profile. So I'll start off with the DBO because that's the 2 cruises that I'm involved in, and also they're embedded in almost all of these programs. And I have a talk already that's been posted on the IARPIC website. And I just wanted to point out that the DBO is expanded from just doing the time series of measurements from physics to nutrients, chlorophyll, plankton, benthic seabirds, marine mammals to include process studies in there. We also have periodic fish sampling as well as bottom trawling. And I'd point out by collaboration with multiple PIs that are also in the area, they're running these lines with the sliders. There's moorings in every one of the DBO 1, 2, 5, number 6, and 8. And I think the important part of this is that we're coordinating with other process groups too. So just to bring us in from the satellites downwards, this is a graphic from Carin, and it's just showing the last 4 years. And I wanted to point out, reiterate that we're seeing an earlier sea ice spring retreat, which has an impact on the phenology and the growth of the phytoplankton and the type of phytoplankton. And the sea ice is returning later, as we know, and this is having an impact on annual primary production. And what you're seeing on the lower right part of the graph is the DBO, the Northern Bering Sea. DBO2 is south of Bering Strait, the DBO3 is north. And I have those red arrows to emphasize in these last 3 or 4 years, the continual decline. What you're seeing is an earlier sea ice retreat there. And above it, on the timing of sea ice breakout, I would point out, and something I will show later, is that 2008 now, the Northern Bering Sea was ice-free by the end of April. And normally it would be done, if you look at those graphics, it would be more like the end of May and early June. So it's been really dramatic last year and this year on the pullback of sea ice and in that system. Next slide. This one here is the looking at the monthly and interannual variability of chlorophyll. And again, I just pointed out the early spring point of almost all, particularly the one south of Bering Strait that you're seeing there, the DBO 1 and 2. But I wanted to point out that we're seeing more fall blooms. You see those north of Bering Strait with the sea ice coming back later, and that has another pulse of carbon that it provides to the system that is not ice algae, that is open water production. Next slide. So this is just a composite from our annual Laurier cruises, some of the operations from physics to biology. We're doing optics with Carin, the relations with NASA on satellite calibrations. Also working with our Canadian colleagues who are doing primary production and other types of process experiments. And this information is available in this slide and can be downloaded via the IARPIC website for more information. But we also have seabird and marine mammal observers on these cruises, and their associated information, the data is being put into the data archive. The second program is Carin Eichen has the lead on this. I am also involved in the Arctic Marine Biodiversity Observing Network, and you can see the composite of the PIs there. It's focused on the Chukchi Sea now, and this is again a summer program. They've had field work in 2015 and 17 to build a biodiversity network. This was as a pilot program. And this includes embeds two of the DBO lines in it with a broader survey mode. And it also includes microbes and genetics into the analyses. And the whole purpose is focused on the environmental drivers' impacts on biodiversity and to continue the long-term data series. And these data are also public available on the IOS website, the Integrated Ocean Observing System site. So just a few examples. We're looking at spatial patterns for the bacteria on the left to marine mammal surveys on the right. And there's just a few of the, embedded in this is a lot of the water mass characteristics, looking at what could some of the key drivers. And you'll see some of these results as we go on through the presentation. We're also looking at maintaining the long-term time series. So Russell Hopcroft's work on the left with zooplankton, and the work we do here on the macrofaunal biomass, as well as others looking at time series of the macrofauna that stay in one place. And what Russ is seeing is that the copepod abundance, so that in the warmer years, the smaller copepods become more dominant, and in the colder years, continuation of having some of these larger calanists become more important in the cold years. And this is reiterated by all other seasonal cruises that have gone on, including by other countries, this between the small and large zooplankton. On the right, we're seeing this actually a real increase north of Bering Strait on some of our time series sites on clams, which are areas that are now, it looks like there's a higher production going on seasonally in that north of Bering Strait area. And results is we're changing from the dominant clams to suspension feeders, taking advantage of what Rebecca Woodgate has been seeing with the moorings, enhanced, not only is there warming, but there's enhanced flow through Bering Strait in recent years. And that means there's more suspended load of detrital material, and these organisms, these certain species of clams are taking advantage of that. So we're seeing this on the upper right-hand graph. You can see where we're seeing a bulging out of the high biomass, and this is a potential prey source for these for walruses and other benthic feeding animals that feed in that area. The other part is to look at interannual variation, and this is an example of 215 was fresher and colder during the AMBON, and it was saltier and warmer in 217, and that has an impact on fish biodiversity. So the warmer the temperatures in 217, Franz Mutter and the team were looking at finding higher biodiversity, but it also means that sometimes that there's fewer birds, and this is what Kathy Coolitz from Fish and Wildlife has found on certain areas that are feeding on certain species. So there's winners and losers that are going to come with these changing conditions that we have. The next one is just close up as looking at the eDNA. This is something that the AMBON is inclusive in their studies. So looking at the water components and then identifying which animals are actually leaving records in the water and using that as a mode to look at biodiversity. And you're asking why are there crocodiles and bees on the lower right? And that's because there are a few glitches on some of the DNA, and that has to do with where they branch off earlier in the tree of life. And so they're working through those glitches on the eDNA aspect. The third one is on ASGARD. This is Seth Danielson and the crew out of UAF and others on they're looking more at the process aspect. And I would point out that they're looking in the late May, June period. I think when they originally were going to be working when there's ice edge production, but as I said, all the ice has been gone since the end of April, so they're looking at the newest levels of processes occurring at the earliest season that we have people working out there, and you can see the composite and the funding agencies on this slide. Next slide is the guiding research question and this is an NPRB funded program. What are the impacts of a reduced ice and what impact that will have on environmental changes that would influence the flow. So this is energy through the northern Bering and into the Chukchi Sea system. And the upper right is showing you the composite of their planned surveys, as well as actually some of the other moorings that are in that area. ASGARD being in where they're doing the process cruises on the yellow dots, but they're occupying these key lines. So the next slide, the focus, as I said, is on process studies on ASGARD. And you're seeing this with, you can see some of the epifunnel trawls that are in the top figure there. You've got a multi-core doing the sediment work, so for the microbial and respiration of sediments. Lower right are some of the incubations. Mid picture is putting over some of the collection and material for collecting things in the water column, and then experiments on the left. And you can see the list of the type of process studies that the ASGARD PIs are looking at in order to look at what are the processes that are set up. And then as we're going with other cruises out in July and August, seeing that also have processes will enable us to put a larger seasonal evaluation into the full system. Next slide. And also that Seth has, there's a composite Chukchi ecosystem observatory. This is a mooring array in the northern part of the Chukchi Sea. It's near Hannah Shoal, and what we found to be a biological hotspot, particularly southwest of, southeast of Hannah Shoal. So it's a very high resolution time series. It has a sediment trap array on it. It's looking at nutrients, phytoplankton identification. And what these moorings that are sitting from the northern Bering Sea, southern Bering Sea too, but northern Bering Sea into the Beaufort, is they allow that finer time series throughout the year that we can then relate and calibrate in the times that we're out there in the field, but to look at what happens in the late fall and the early spring when cruises are not there. And you can see the composite of measurements that are being done all by sensor arrays or collections. And there's a web link on the lower part of the slide. So next slide, next one, is actually, this one's entitled Views into Event Timing, Magnitude, and Co-variability. And this is just one of the results from the sediment trap array. This is the sediment trap is in collaboration with Catherine Lalonde out of the University of Laval in Quebec. So she's been collaborating with the CEO team. And what you're seeing there is a composite from looking under ice graphs, underwater, light, and you can see the seasonality from left is September to the right in August. And when the sediment trap, if you go down to chlorophyll, it's high, and you can see that fall bloom I was mentioning, and just the beginning of the spring bloom, the chlorophyll in July and August. But what really shows what's happening of the export production is the sediment trap and the ice algae, and that pegs just to the ice algae. So it's pulling it up starting in early April in the northern Chukchi, with carbon going down from ice algae in May and June, and a real peak in July, early in July, and that's when the ice is really pulled back at that point. And then you can see how the diatoms, she's identifying those. And on the right, you can see some of the epitropic response to that. We have bearded seals, Arctic cod, and zooplankton. And so they're using acoustic backscatter to look at some of that information. And they have, like I said, you can see some of these results on that webpage. The next composite study is from the another part of the Arctic program from the North Pacific Research Board is the Arctic Integrated Ecosystem Survey. And Franz Mutter, Ed Farley involved, and others that you see listed there. And on this, they're going out in the August-September timeframe and including trawls, be able to look at the fish species on that and some of the epibenthic animals that are there. But associated, they're doing environmental measurements, temperature, salinity, chlorophyll. If you go on the next slide, their main question, how will warming likely affect the abundance of fish and invertebrates? And the findings that you're starting to see is the decline in the Arctic cod, which is very much associated with the sea ice, up in the saffron cod, uncertainty on the Bering herring, the capelin, and these are forage fishes. For example, capelin, chum salmon is up, pink salmon is up, jellyfish are up. So they are seeing through their time series studies that they've been able to do these trends in these fishes as well as some of the invertebrates. On the next one is the oceanographic and fish sampling. So here's just some of the gears that they use. And I think what's important is to look at that acoustic backscatter that they have from 212, 213, and 217. With 217 really being, it was a very warm year. That's what you're seeing in the background too. There was a broader distribution of fish. It was because of this warmer water. So this brings in the question of the potential of fisheries and even levels of commercial fisheries at some point moving into the Chukchi Sea, more northern part but also on a program that I won't discuss, but we did discuss at a meeting I was at a few weeks ago, and that's the Central Arctic Ocean and the movement of potential species from in the Pan-Arctic system from the Atlantic that it's already occurring, and in the Pacific potentially into the Central Arctic Ocean. As you probably all know, there's a 16-year moratorium on commercial fisheries until more science to understand the system is brought forward. So on the next slide is Carin Ashjian's program and her colleagues there looking at the importance of shelf break upwelling to the upper trophic level ecology. And this is now moving into the Western Beaufort Sea. Next slide. And a key question is, why are the beluga whales found at the transition between shallow and deep, basically the shelf break? And as you probably realize too, is that the ice with the pullback is pulling back quite a bit in the Beaufort Sea, moving over that shelf break. And we know there's potential for enhanced upwelling, and I think some of Carin's results have shown that. But what you're seeing here is where the bowheads are near shore and the belugas are offshore. So that was a key question for their program. Next slide. So what they're finding is that the shelf break, because it's why they're there, as you might expect, is these animals want to eat, and they're eating Arctic cod prey at high numbers, which are at the shelf break. And so they're looking at the plankton, feeding the Arctic cod, and then of course being the prey base for belugas. And the mechanism that they're testing and have been finding for is that winds from the east, they're followed by low winds that then concentrate the copepod in this and krill, and that this attracts the Arctic cod to those that region on the slope. And then they're there, and then of course then they're taken over and eaten and preyed upon by belugas. So their approach is using tows, plankton tows, fish trawls. They have moorings in place, and also they're doing size fractionation. And you can see by the map on the lower right, and you can ask Carin any questions because she's online for the next talk about any of this part of that research program. So I just want to summarize, we are seeing the biological sampling is across space and time, and I think that's the critical part. Be it by process cruises that are going out seasonally. We have moorings that are looking at annual and interannual of certain parameters. We have observing transect lines such as the DBO, AMBON, and their biodiversity aspects. And the repeat time and space occupations have allowed us to look at the drivers for those biological, both what we're seeing and the parameters, what are influencing key processes, and how they may be changing over time to look at those trends. The time series analysis, as I said, they have multiple components that feeding in both the biology and biochemistry by the changes in the physical forcing. We are seeing shifts due to the timing of sea ice by going out earlier and coming back later. We're seeing warming temperatures, and we're seeing changes in current speeds, and these current speeds have an impact on the type of animals and the type of food and when they're actually going to be able to collect that material of which they grow. And I think an important aspect, all these programs and what the data sets by the interactions that we have is to look at what the lower trophic level prey base and how they're associated with the upper trophic level feeding and movement. And it's that combination of observations, process studies, and the timing of those that are an important part of understanding how that northern Bering and Chukchi Sea and into the Beaufort Sea, the Pacific Arctic region, what it's doing now, what it's done in the past, and also where it may be going in the future. So with that, I would just want to say thanks and take your comments, or maybe take comments after Carin. I'm not sure how, Guillermo, you want to do that. I put some of the links that are there for the programs where data sets are found, and I'm sure there are more, but I didn't go through all of them. So with that, I want to thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Questions for Jackie. We have time now for one or two questions.
Guillermo, it's Martin.
Go.
Jackie, thanks very much. You showed a slide with a down arrow against Arctic cod, and they're a native species. And underneath it, you showed saffron cod going up, and they're an immigrant species, if you will. That's my alternative to invasive. But you also showed that interesting slide about the distribution of bowhead and beluga whales, and you suggested the mechanism driving the separation of the two relates to the presence of Arctic cod on the shelf break that the beluga enjoy. If there are fewer Arctic cod, or if we're heading in that direction, are beluga likely to adapt to saffron cod, or do we know if they do actually prey on saffron cod?
That's a good question. I would say that the Arctic ice studies, they're on the continental shelf. So they've been looking at in that August and September period. And what Carin had in the Beaufort one was actually where they would be tracking out and feeding on the slope, where we're seeing enhanced upwelling with wind events and concentration of prey. To answer your questions, I think they're in this, this is my guess. I don't know. I don't have a fish person on, but saffron, if there's an organism which is about the same size, I don't believe they have the same lipid content as Arctic cod, but they would change their prey base. The only thing I would say is that I think the saffron cod, the previous papers I read from Fons and others, is that they were more in the coastal water. So if they're going up, what we don't see on those figures was the spatial, they'd be more in that Alaska coastal water. That's what I saw in previous figures, and that the Arctic cod were more in the more sailing, colder water. So whether they would switch feed on a different size, I'm uncertain about answering that without a fisheries person adding in. But as a person who eats different things, I would think that if they can get it in their mouth, they would go after whatever the largest prey patch is, the place they're going.
Hi, Jackie. You do have a fish person on. This is Morgan. How are you?
Fine, great. You can answer it correctly now.
Yeah, well, you were correct about everything concerning the distribution of saffron cod being more inshore and the lipid content. There have been several studies that show that they aren't as nutritious as Arctic cod, and a lot of people are saying that, well, maybe they're going to replace them eventually. But there's also been a couple of studies that say in the short term, during this warming period, that Arctic cod are actually going to increase as far as recruitment success. But that's eventually going to, that's eventually going to end. The party will be over eventually.
Thanks. So do you think they would, if they go down in populations, would they still be more, would they potentially be higher on the slope areas? Carin's through those mechanisms of wind concentrating location of like zooplankton and where the fish would go?
Their feeding habits are a little bit different. And like I say, being closer to shore, the saffron cod eat mostly smaller copepods. They eat a lot of the stuff that Arctic cod, being more offshore, don't eat. There is definitely a difference in the.
Jackie, this is Guillermo. How unusual was 2017 in terms of the fish diversity that you just mentioned? Is that the first time we have so much diversity, or previous warm years were showing the similar degree of diversity? Hello? Okay. Can you hear me, Meredith? Yes.
Yep.
I think we lost Jackie. Jackie, are you there? Okay.
Video too.
If not, I will move to the next speaker, Dr. Carin Ashjian from WHOI. Carin is going to tell us to discuss the Synoptic Arctic Survey, a developing multi-nation interdisciplinary survey of the Arctic Ocean. Carin?
Okay, thank you. And Meredith, I'm just going to say next slide when it's time, okay? So I'm going to talk today about a developing project that it's international in scope. It's called the Synoptic Arctic Survey. And hopefully people have heard about this before. And this project is being developed by a whole range of people from many different nations. I'm giving the presentation today, but Ara Olsen and Oyvind Pasch and Leif Andersen have been really leading the charge on it. And Jackie and I have been working on it from the United States. And you'll see some other names in a few more slides about many of the others who have been working on it. And we've also had a great response from people who reviewed our science plan. Next slide, please. So some of the motivations for developing this program were, first of all, that Eddie Carmack noted that, and he's right, that the view we have of the Arctic, that he calls it the Arctic Mediterranean, is really regional. We do a lot of work in regionals, in regions, particularly those that are close to where we live, or where, to our area, to our home waters. But we haven't done as much work in other areas, and we certainly haven't not done work on the Arctic Ocean synoptically or as a whole, despite efforts to do pan-Arctic work, because that is, we have certainly had the idea that pan-Arctic is important, but it turns out that when we look at observations, we still are they're sorely lacking on a pan-Arctic scale. And another reason that we want to do this kind of work is because Jackie just gave a great example of the information you can get by repeatedly sampling over multiple years in one of the regions of the Arctic, that you can see how ongoing changes in sea ice are impacting changes in the biology and the physics. This is really difficult for a lot of the portions of the Arctic Ocean, particularly the Central Basin, because we don't have the baseline studies with which to compare those conditions for much of the region. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of showing some data or the locations of, well, actually is actual data that was compiled by Bodil Bloom in a paper in Progress in Oceanography, and she actually borrowed these from other works of her own. But you can see that looking on the top left, this is some zooplankton biomass estimates, and you can see they're very much concentrated to the north of the Barents Sea and along the slope there, along the north of Russia, and also there's a good number of them over in the to the north of Alaska. And this is in the central Arctic, because of course there's a lot more work that was done on the shelves that just aren't on these maps. And similarly for the macrobenthos biomass, and there's not been all that much work in many regions of the Arctic Ocean. And so it makes it difficult for us to assess whether the different regions are responding similarly to change or differently, and also whether they're responding at all. Next slide, please. So this group of scientists have come up with an overarching question, and what we're interested in is what the present state is, and what are the major ongoing transformations of the Arctic marine system. And specifically for this project, we are thinking about the ecosystem and carbon systems. Both of those are much less well studied than the physical system and some other aspects of the chemical system. The physical system, and of course, provides the framework or background on which both the ecosystem and the carbon system rest. And so that continues to be an integral part of this project. And some of our goals are to describe the present state of the Arctic Ocean, to provide the foundation against which future changes can be compared to in order to be able to quantify change. We have three key foci. One, of course, is the physical drivers of importance to both the ecosystem and carbon cycle, and the ecosystem response, and the carbon cycle and ocean acidification. And the vision of this is that it would provide the foundation upon which future studies could rest, with a grand vision of it being able to be repeated, perhaps decadally. Next slide, please. So under this overarching question on what are the present state and major ongoing transformations of this Arctic marine system, we have three also somewhat broad research questions in each of our three focal areas. Under the physical response area, we are interested in the changes in water mass sources, sinks, and transformations of water masses. We're also interested in the states of and changes in the heat and freshwater budgets in the Arctic regions. And we're interested in how Arctic Ocean water masses and circulation respond to changes in sea ice properties and atmospheric, advective, and freshwater forcing. Turning now to the ecosystem response, again, think of these as larger overarching questions. One of them focuses on primary production, and we want to know how primary production and the associated availability of nutrients varies between the different Arctic regions. How are this responding in the different Arctic regions to the physical forcing mechanisms? And in particular, you can think of this as looking at whether or not primary production is likely to increase in each of the regions and on a pan-Arctic scale. We're also interested in northward range expansion of subarctic species, and does this vary regionally? And are these species likely to be able to establish permanent populations in the Arctic regions, or are they going to continue to be expatriates being carried in the or coming in with in the summer with the currents, but potentially unable to reproduce successfully in the Arctic, and thus only visitors or immigrants. And finally, we're interested in how biomass flow varies across the different regional ecosystems of the Arctic. And this is really a trophic linkages question. In what compartments of the ecosystem is the biomass found, and how might it be transformed between those different compartments? And does this differ across the different regions? Finally, moving to the carbon cycle and go back and acidification questions. Thank you. We are interested in what the contribution of the Arctic Ocean is to maintaining global ocean carbon dioxide reservoir and uptake. We're interested in the input and fate of terrestrial and subsea carbon to the Arctic Ocean, and think here about riverine input carrying materials that are being released from the melting permafrost, as well as potentially the release of I'm losing it, but hydrates from the Arctic Ocean, the carbon coming up as hydrates. And finally, we're interested in the magnitude and drivers and impacts of ocean acidification in the different regions of the ocean. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, this is an international researcher-driven initiative. Some of the names of the people who have been working on this are listed at the top of this figure. We've also included the flags of nine different nations. It's truly a pan-Arctic, pan-national effort, international effort. And I've put down some of the logos of some of the institutions that work where these investigators work are also shown below. But the group has been endeavoring to include representatives from all of the different nations who are interested in doing research in the Arctic in our workshops and meetings and correspondence. Next slide, please. And the timeline is actually much more complicated than this, or has more events on it than I've put on here. But I thought I'd put some highlights up. The idea was conceived at a meeting excuse me, I have to turn my lights back on. Japan-Norway Marine Science Week. Well, I guess they didn't. And it was followed up by an international SAS workshop in Washington, D.C. at the Norwegian Embassy. Following that, there's been a number of other meetings. One of them notably was held in St. Petersburg, Russia, so that Russian oceanographers and interested scientists could join in the discussions. In the United States, we held a town hall at the Ocean Sciences meeting in 2016, and there was a workshop in Gothenburg, Sweden, at which we started to develop the science and implementation plan. The science and implementation plan was completed in 2017. A national group was formed in Sweden in that year. There was a presentation in a steering committee meeting in Prague at the Arctic Ocean Sciences Week. And a presentation also was done at the Ocean Carbon and Biogeochemistry meeting in Woods Hole in June of 2017. In 2018, there was a meeting held in Japan at which there were international representatives as well, and there was a national meeting in Norway. Also in 2018, we solicited reviews of the science plan. The reviewers were from all the many different nations, and everyone was very kind and accommodating and spent time to give us really good reviews. And right now we're in the process of incorporating those revisions into the science plan. And Jackie and I are working on planning an implementation meeting that we hope to hold in Woods Hole in the fall of 2018, at which we as United States scientists could better develop a SAS effort and implement a SAS effort ourselves, but also the international group could work together to identify how we're actually going to do this, hopefully what ships we might have available, or if not, well, some of the ships are already known to be available, but how would we do cross fertilization? How would we make sure that between the different groups, how would we make sure we have parity of techniques in between the different efforts, and how are we going to achieve education, outreach, and training. And then right now, the Synoptic Arctic Survey is planned for 2020, which seems rather soon, but that's what the goal has been for now. Next slide, please. So this shows the Arctic Ocean. The lines on here are transect lines that we would optimally like to occupy. I suspect that we could potentially move some of them at our future workshops. However, this is where the status of the lines right now. As you can see, it's pretty, we try to cover many different regions of the Arctic, including those which have not been sampled very often. So for example, we have work in the Chukchi Sea as well as in the Canada Basin, but we also are hoping to do transects to the north of the Canadian archipelago and Greenland, a region that is chronically undersampled because it's been so difficult to access it. We're covering the gateways, the shelf seas, and the deep basins. And the measurements that would be conducted would be physical, chemical, and biological measurements. We would use common protocols and the most recent protocols so that we would have common sampling methodology from all the different ships that would participate. We would do full depth stations at locations every 20 nautical miles. I think the benthic sampling for some of the deep locations would be a little bit less frequent than that because of the incredible amount of time it takes to do that. And we would have the stations be closer over areas of rapidly changing topography, such as on ridges and shelf slopes. Next slide, please. One of the models that we've been looking to is the GO-SHIP model. This is the Global Ocean Ship-Based Hydrographic Investigations Program. Admittedly, I had never heard of this before until Jim Swift started talking about it in Gothenburg. But these are some of the track lines over which the GO-SHIPs have been working over the past decade or so, or maybe even longer. And they have an array of what they call level 1 variables that they measure across these lines following strict protocols, and they concentrate on heat, carbon, ocean acidification, oxygen, ventilation rates, etc. And the data are quickly made available, and they're also synthesized into global data products. Next slide, please. So the idea is to think of the SAS as sort of an Arctic GO-SHIP effort, but it adds the ecosystem, which the GO-SHIP does not include. So the idea would be to adopt a model for Arctic ship-based fieldwork. And that because we have a lot of variability in the Arctic, we also have a large number of available ships, which is kind of an amazing statement if you think about it. But when you start really counting them up, you can see several of them on the left-hand panel of this slide. There are quite a few ships in the different nations. There's a lot of interest in the Arctic research, and also the Arctic Ocean is relatively small, actually. And so it is possible to execute this survey in a single year and with enough ships, perhaps only with, say, 6-week cruises. The idea would be, again, to repeat it every decade and to include an ecosystem sampling program, unlike the GO-SHIP program. Next slide, please. This is the set of measurements that we came up with in our science plan. Above the first dashed line, we have the physical and chemical measurements, and most of these, in fact, all of these would be conducted using the rosette. These, again, would follow the GO-SHIP practices. Below the first dashed line, we start in with the ecosystem measurements, and we would be looking at the planktonic ecosystem, ranging all the way from viruses and bacteria all the way up to ichthyoplankton, hopefully to fish. Kind of hard to do a real big trawl when you're in sea ice, but we seem to have less of that problem with that recently. And marine mammals, and also we would like to look at some seabirds, which are listed down under other. They're not really being measured in the water column, they're observed. And then we would like to have a benthic measurements as well, and both looking at the myo and macrofauna as well as the epifauna. And for both the water column and the benthic measurements, we would like to look at some carbon transformation rates. So things such as primary production, sinking, respiration in the water column, etc. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, training, education, and outreach, we believe are integral to the design, and so we would incorporate ways to accomplish this throughout the program. One thing that we had thought about would be that it would be really, well, it would be that we would like to design it so that we can have ships meet up in the at common locations, so we can all sample the same water and make sure that our techniques are equivalent on all of the ships. But also it would be a nice opportunity to have communication and maybe even transfer some of the younger scientists between the different ships so that everybody can work on other ships. Another thought would be that Norwegian scientists, for example, could send their postdocs to work on a US ship and vice versa, so that we can really start to get the younger scientists and the graduate students and the postdocs experiencing the broader international community and getting to meet people and trying to nurture the next generation to really work on an international and pan-Arctic way. Next slide, please. These are some slides that my Norwegian colleagues put together, but I've got them in here because I'd like to emphasize that the other nations are really taking their bit in their teeth and are galloping forward. And so China, and we don't know what China's doing, but Japan and Korea are pretty firm on their commitment to do this. There may be some work done in the by Pinro over in the Eastern Arctic. The Odin might think about trying to do these very difficult stations to the north of Greenland. Next slide. We're hoping that we can get Russia and Germany to work over on the along the Russian coast, where, for example, the United States isn't going to be able to go. Perhaps the UK could do some of the gateways in the Eastern Arctic. Next slide, please. Canada, perhaps working in the Canada Basin or in the northern Baffin Bay area. And finally, the United States, they've got, next slide, PIN to go across the Arctic, which I think, is probably unrealistic in terms of ship time. So we'll have to work on how they can go, if the US sends a ship, it can go up and go back to the same side. Next slide, please. There have been a few questions. One is that Mosaic is going to be ongoing during this, and we see this as a complement, not rather than as competition or exclusionary, and it would permit, that a lot of work that they would be working at the same time as this effort would be ongoing for the period that this work would be ongoing. And so that would be a really kind of a micro study within one of the region, and the rest of it would be a much broader scale look. Also, the science plan does not explicitly include things such as moorings, ITPs, remote sensing, and modeling right now. They're not part of the SAS as of now, but there's with a lot of synergy, national projects can include them. And it's also important to point out that a lot of the things that we're trying to measure still can't be measured successfully on some of these autonomous installations. And as a community, we're all trying to move forward to improve that situation. Next slide, please. So our next steps are that we want to finalize the science plan. As I mentioned before, we're in the process of doing the revisions. We're in the process of forming national teams. And each of those teams will then, according to the way you do it in your country, would be writing proposals to apply for ship time, and would be working on getting people who are interested in joining the project to write proposals and hopefully pull together a successful program. We'll have a science steering group overarching all of the different projects that will have representatives from each of the participating nations. And as I mentioned, we're planning to have a meeting in the fall of 2018 here in Woods Hole. And that's my last slide. So does anyone
Thank you so much, Carin. Are there any questions for Carin?
Guillermo, it's Martin.
Yes.
Carin, thank you very much for that latest summary on the Synoptic survey, something that I think many of us have been familiar with for a while. Well, I guess I would agree with your characterization that it doesn't conflict with Mosaic, and indeed they can complement each other. The main, nevertheless, and you say the ships are or likely to be available, but the challenge may be more than that, and budget pressures and so on. And I'm thinking of NSF, for example, which is investing a very large sum of money in the US contribution to Mosaic, and that therefore perhaps begs the question of contributing to a US contribution to the Synoptic survey. Of course, NSF is not the only game in town. There's NOAA, obviously an agency you would immediately think of, but still the budget pressures are still there.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and Jackie and I are acutely conscious of that. And recall that this isn't led by us, and it's an international effort, and so our mission is to figure out realistically if it's possible to do it in 2020 in terms of all both not only the budget pressures but also the logistic things such as getting the agreements in place to work together, et cetera, et cetera. So you're absolutely right. I can't, as I said, it's an international effort, and so I think we have to collect the data that will turn the tide to put it off another year if that's what is indeed going to happen, because otherwise I understand that, it might be difficult for the U.S. to participate. It's kind of a roundabout answer, but I think you could try to read between the lines.
Carin, is there any interest from NASA?
I don't, that's a good question. I haven't heard explicitly, and even though we talked about it at the Ocean and Carbon and Biogeochemistry meeting in last June, I don't believe the NASA program managers were participants in that workshop.
Okay, because I was thinking Synoptic, and that's something you can also complement with satellite information. So
exactly, that's a great idea, Grebmeier.
Are there any other questions for Carin?
Hi, Carin. It's Candace from NOAA Fisheries.
Thank you
for thanks for a really great presentation. And while I was listening to this, and your last slide really made me think about the agreement to prevent unregulated fisheries in the high seas of the Central Arctic Ocean that Jackie alluded to in her presentation. And I've been part of the U.S. team that's been working on an implementation plan to get some sort of international joint program of scientific research and monitoring together for that. And we, at our last meeting in Ottawa in October, talked about vessels of opportunity and using those to help us collect data. And so I'm wondering if there might be some sort of synergy or way that this effort can kind of tie into the information and data that we've been looking to try and collect on that other effort.
Oh, I can't imagine that there couldn't. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not aware of what the other effort is doing, but and what what you would think would be required to do that. But I think the idea is to reach out, and we can expand on this as best we can by synergizing with other efforts. So I can't imagine that there wouldn't be. Were you thinking of that you would try to use these ships as platforms for more work, or was it simply a way that would all work together to share results?
Probably both, but you and I could definitely talk further about this.
I think we should talk further about this because the manpower to do that, the work that I put on that table, we sketched it out, and it is definitely possible to do it by working together. Different groups working together. You could fit on the ships, but it's not like we have a huge amount of unoccupied available berths on the ships.
Oh, of course, understood.
But you notice there is some fish on there, so already that's and of course the whatever fish are going to go in the Central Arctic are going to depend on whatever all the other trophic levels we're measuring. So I think there's still room for lots of synergies.
Absolutely, thank you.
Any other, there is time for one more quick question.
Guillermo, this is Sarah. I do have a question about these recommended set of measurements. How different are these recommended set of measurements different from what a DBO cruise would be taking already?
So, the DBO cruises, there's recommended measurements for DBO cruises, but they don't take all these measurements. For example, my DBO cruise, I don't ever sample the benthos, but I sample DBO lines all the time. And so this would be really dedicated and would really be making an effort to sample across all the trophic levels And the methods and the approaches that we actually put on this table, I think, came from the I'm forgetting the names of these organizations.
CDMP, the CDMP.
Yes, exactly. This is, yeah, Jackie and I worked from that. So, you know, so some of the DBO lines have multiple trophic levels sampled, but many of them don't. And some of them really only get physical oceanography sampled. So it's really a different approach to be comprehensive in our look on a synoptic scale across the Arctic.
And just thanks, Carin. And just one more question: did I see in an earlier slide that you viewed the team views this as like a decadal activity?
That would be the vision.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And is there going to be a meeting at ASSW about this, or just kind of off side meetings?
So I'm not sure right now. It's unfortunate Jackie's not on the line because I'm not going to ASSW. So I haven't really kept up with what's going on. I don't know if they've had one. There was a presentation in Prague, and there's been meetings. Well, certainly the United States have been several meetings. So I know they're planning to have some sort of a presence there, but I'm not sure of the specifics.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, gosh, we're having internet. I would just the last thing I heard two things. I would just say we had discussion on the SAS with the Japanese. They're having, as an update, they're having their third Asian meeting in about 2 weeks. Takashi just emailed where they're having discussions of the Synoptic Arctic Survey and their commitment to that. So we might hear back from China on that one. The DBO, has some parts in it, like we have the Atlantic DBO, that's some key measurements, but this synoptic survey would be a lot more, would include fisheries. As far as cities, you have the NAVOS program, and so, the incorporation of some of these on a Russian ship doing transects in the Russian side, we could share those data. The Nansen Legacy Project they have a set line that they're also going to do. Part of it is the DBO that there's some interest on that to expand, to incorporate as part of the Circum Arctic. The Canadians are doing fisheries, moving more into, and that's out of the DFO, are moving more into the Central Arctic. And finally, I just want to say that the Synoptic Arctic Survey will be presented by yours truly during the Pacific Arctic Group meeting, the Marine Working Group meeting. And we do discuss this all the time with the Central Arctic Ocean Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Committee that's putting together a report for the Arctic Council, PAIN, CAF, and ICES and Pisces, all those lovely acronyms. So that's just a brief, in a nutshell. This is being discussed as one, along with, the long.
Internet problems.
Guillermo, it's Martin. Please, could I ask
Yes, Martin. Yes, please.
Thank you. While I recognize that many of these measurements and observations, you do need ships and people, but I wondered if there had been discussion about the potential for using unmanned underwater systems for at least some of the measurements, and particularly in areas where it's still going to be challenging to get ships in.
So we talked, I think people are aware of these these systems. But I think we really want to try to do this as an integrated whole. And so although there is room for individual efforts under the SAS umbrella, we want to do an integrated ecosystem physical carbon effort. And that also includes sampling at similar temporal and spatial scales. So it's not that it can't be used, but we want to ensure that the core actually gets measured. If that makes sense to you. For example, there's a lot of stuff on this list that cannot be measured, that are the very things that are what we're lacking in the Central Arctic.
Okay, thanks, Carin.
Thank you to Carin and Jackie for their presentations. Actually, I want to compliment both of you for pushing for the ecosystem component to be included in the SAS effort. I remember when I attended the 2015 meeting at the Embassy of Norway, it was only physical oceanography. And thank you for including and integrating an ecosystem component into this program. I think it's very important to see the whole picture.